even cried a little towards the end. It's extremely poetic. It's very intelligent and intellectual and cerebral, but also I thought extremely sensual and has a wonderful sense of place. It's set between Paris and Thailand. And I thought, Amanda, if you could just give everybody a little bit of a sense of what this novel is and what you attempted to do with it and pulled off beautifully, by the way. So tell us a little bit. It's always challenging to talk about a novel people haven't read, but I'd love it if you could just kind of give us a little info. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, and thank you so much for those lovely words and for being in conversation with me. And thanks also to Alice and Audrey at the American Library and to all of you for being here. It's really nice to see familiar faces and some unfamiliar faces. I'm really happy to be able to talk about the book. So, a little about the novel. It's the story of Elena, who's in her late 20s, a little bit adrift, a little bit struggling to find her place in the world. And she goes to Paris. She's an American, and she goes to Paris on a research trip, and she finds an old friend of her late mother, a woman called Siobhan, who's a little bit bizarre, very elegant, and they develop a sort of unusual friendship. And Elena realizes that Siobhan has her own tragedy that she's dealing with. Siobhan has a daughter, Ella, who disappeared 6 years before the novel opened. And over the course of their conversations, Elena agrees to look at the journals that Ella left behind. Ella was living in Thailand when she disappeared, and try to make some sense of them for Siobhan. And so she finds herself engaged in this odd, unlikely project where she's looking at these journal fragments and trying to figure out what happened, trying to reconstruct some sense of a narrative. And as Elena kind of becomes more fully engaged in the project, she finds herself adopting Ella's mannerisms, starting to kind of act out certain dramas that she reads about in the journals. And it starts kind of leaking into her life in Paris as she's trying to reconstruct this other woman's life in Thailand. And I think one of the things I was interested in doing in the book was showing both the pleasure of projecting oneself into another life and the dangers of this, of kind of losing track of who one is and what one is doing. So I think there's that doubleness that happens in the book. And the other thing I should say is that there are three voices in the novel. There's the voice of Elena as she's talking about her present day life in Paris. And then there's the voice of the journals. So you see fragments of Ella's journals. And then finally, there's a reconstructed narrative. So there's a novel within a novel, which is the story that Elena winds up writing about Ella's disappearance and Ella's life in Thailand. So there are these three different registers that might help us in our conversation.
Why don't you start by reading a little bit from the novel, just so we get a sense of the tone?
Of course, yes. I'm gonna start with the opening, which gives you a sense of Elena's arrival in Paris. And I don't have to say that much about it because it's the very first pages. And I'll read for about 5 minutes. I have been up all night, and now the day is gray. The narrow streets slick and silvered outside the taxi window. Sleeplessness gives the city an unreal, varnished air. Shops, shutters, pigeons, and trees all flickering and chromed, like movie stills cut together in the old way. The driver stops along stone steps that lead uphill. He tells me again that the street I am looking for does not exist. On the ride from the airport, he spoke of his childhood in Montmartre, of parties in squares strung with lights, where children were allowed to stay up dancing. As he spoke, he looked into the rearview mirror, his gaze warm, soliciting. Sometimes I give the impression of not paying attention, but I'm gleaning all I can from the present, encoding it carefully. It is unlikely that this man, who has lived here all his life, does not know my street. Perhaps he is right. None of it is real. Siobhan, the flat, the missing girl. I find the Place Marcel Aimé on my GPS and show the driver. His bright laugh fills the car. He swivels into reverse. Maybe I was mispronouncing the name. On the square, which exists, my eyes travel up the building facade, balcony after balcony, to a dome with a topmost window, which will be mine. Through sheets of cloud, sun strikes the wet brick and stone. Looking up like that gives me vertigo. By the door, which faces the square, a tree sways under its burden of pink, excessive blooms. At the square's far end, people are gathered. They are looking at something hidden from my view by their windbreakers and backpacks. When the group drifts away, I approach, leaving my suitcase by the door. The statue is of a man stuck in the wall, or emerging, I can't tell. His face of dark bronze is resigned. His fingers, long and expressive, reach toward me out of the stones, rubbed gold by many eager living hands. As I move to touch the fingers, a high, shrill voice stops me. Isa! A woman from the tourist group is gazing at me from the street. Isa, she says again, and runs down the slope that joins the street to the square. Embarrassed, I stand still, my legs taking root among the stones. My face is one people think they know, and strangers will often tell me I remind them of someone. When she sees me up close, this woman too will find some detail in my face to set her right. She'll apologize, ashamed of her error, but aglow with the memory of whomever she took me for. Now she runs across the square, her black hair loose behind her, her low heels unsteady on the cobblestones. She reaches me, breathless, and takes my hands, pressing them to her chest. Her forehead is broad and her eyes are black and wet with tears. Isabel, she says. Her smile makes me want to smile too. No, I say. She steps back and studies me, probing my gaze for recognition. But Isabel, it's you. Of course it's you. She laughs again, but more sadly this time, performing a calculation. If it was you, you wouldn't tell me, she says, squeezing my hands. Her touch is warm, her skin a little dry. No, I'm not her. I'm not Isa. My name is Elena. I'm sorry. I am sorry. I've hurt her without meaning to. To appease her, I ask, when did you know Isa, Isabel? The ground of stones swells up like the sea, and the woman looks at me with such confusion that I turn away, embarrassed, and move quickly with my suitcase into the building. Leaning against a wall of mirror in the foyer, I watch her retreat across the square. A scene like this shouldn't bother me so much, but the world is strange today. I've been awake all night, crossing the ocean, and now I can't shake her look of need. I'm not Isa, but the time I've lived and don't remember deprives me of certainties. I'm sick of grasping, still, for the strong, solid shore where life can begin. I imagine myself arriving at Ella's door, or finding her on a beach or in a square, and saying, Ella, Ella, do you know how long your mother, your real mother, has been looking for you? I'll bring them together, mother and daughter. I can do nothing for the woman outside, but I can help Siobhan. I believe that Ella is alive and can be found. I'll stop there.
Thank you, that's beautiful. And that gives us a sense really of what the entire novel is about in that one capsule scene, but also of the language, which is very poetic and not overwritten and quite cinematic too, I think, in terms of, it's kind of a quest story, as you say, a detective novel. I want to ask you a little bit about the title, Her Here. Tell me, where did that come from?
Her Here was a late addition to the work. For years and years, I thought of it under the working title, which is The Trace. So, and I think, for me, The Trace is somewhat obvious in a story about a disappearance and a tracking and trying to find, someone who's missing through writing. But I was talking to my editor at Bellevue, and she said, you know, there are just too many novels that have come out with the title The Trace, including the excellent novel by Forrest Gander that came out in 2015. So I thought, okay, well, I'll start looking for another title. And um, there were pages and pages of ideas, brainstorms, suggestions, but there's a line early on in the book, and it's a line, it was actually it was the first line of the novel in certain drafts, and it remained in the novel. And it's a line when when Elena arrives in Paris in the scene I just read, she's already met Siobhan, and she's agreed to come and stay in Paris more permanently to work on these journals, kind of with and for Siobhan. And when she gets up to the room that she's going to live in, and she finds the journals, Ella's journals there, waiting for her, she starts to read a little bit, and she's struggling. She's having a hard time in her life, and she reads about these landscapes that Ella describes, and all of the kind of just ebullient joy with which Ella, kind of this young woman, is encountering the world. And she has this kind of line that comes to her: "I'd rather be her than here." Even though she knows that Ella is missing, you know, she doesn't know really what's happened to her. But that line for me was, you know, it was something like in music, the sort of the little phrase that helped me kind of understand Elena's character, especially in these early scenes of the novel, and she's really just trying to figure out, you know, what she's doing on Earth. So she kind of immediately wants to project herself into this other life.
So this novel is set between Paris, where Elena comes to reconstruct the life of Ella through her journals, and Thailand, where Ella had been living before she disappears. Where did this book come about? I mean, it shifts between not just voices, but also registers. We have the Paris scenes, and then we have these kind of lush Thai scenes. I know this is a question that novelists get asked often, and I'm not asking you what's your inspiration, but I do want to know where this book kind of came about, and why Thailand.
Yeah, I mean, why Thailand is a good question, and I think, you know, for me, I when I graduated from college, I went to Thailand to teach English, and I did this. You know, I never really quite knew why I wanted to go. I'd studied a lot of kind of Buddhist philosophy in college, and I was interested in philosophy. I was interested in different ways of kind of living and thinking about the world and thinking about the self. And I was just very hungry for experience and adventure. And maybe, you know, like Ella, there were also some things I needed to escape. I think that the novel is really kind of interested in that hinge between adventure and escape that travel and living in different places can sometimes give us. So when I was living in Thailand for about a year and a half, I was taking notes all the time. I was writing, I was doing character sketches, I was kind of making little stories. Um, and so I knew that I wanted to write about this time. I knew that I was kind of living something that challenged me in ways that I wanted to think about through fiction. But it wasn't until much later that I found a form in which to write about Thailand. And I was a graduate student, and I decided to focus on French philosophy. And I was immersed in these thinkers who, like Derrida, and the name The Trace, the early working title of the novel is an allusion, I think, to, you know, to some of what I was reading when I was coming up with the form of the novel. But I became really interested in this idea that the self is composed of something unknowable, that there's this other that you can't know at the heart of the self, and that, you know, what we think of when we think of identity is actually much less stable, and that it's contextual and made up of things that we can't always control or understand or even really recognize. And the philosophy that I was reading, it felt urgent to me. It felt important. It felt like something I wanted to get not only my head around, but my heart around. I think this was kind of my way of trying to experiment and explore the meaning of the philosophy that I was reading and trying to understand. So I think when I created the Elena Ella dyad, it was kind of an experiment in thinking, okay, Elena is sort of starting to know herself through this other that she can only know through journal fragments, through these words she left behind. So
which is kind of like the act of writing fiction.
yeah. Yeah, definitely. And reading. I mean, I think there's that sense of getting lost in someone else's life, in a different life, and being able to sort of relax your sense of identity in order to experience something potentially really rich. And I think, I mean, yeah, you're right, Rachel. It's very much that was very much on my mind. As you know, especially in the scenes when Elena is encountering the journals and she reads something and a scene comes to her, and so she starts to describe the scene.
It's very stylistically and philosophically complex, but also a really gripping read. Like there's a plot. What happens? What happens? And it's also a plot based on kind of a strange premise, which is that by inventing a fictional version of Ella's life, perhaps her mother can figure out what actually happened to her. I mean, it's kind of there's a lot of hope and a lot of artistic, I think, kind of promise in that premise, but also it's also, it doesn't, I won't give away the ending, but it's uh the tell us a little bit just about what that means to attempt to reconstruct a life that way.
I think that, the relationship between Elena and Siobhan is a relationship that I was really interested in. They're not a mother and daughter pair, but it's this mother who's lost a daughter and a daughter who's lost a mother, and they're searching for something kind of in the other, and sort of by working on Ella's life and trying to find out what happened. So I think it's true that there is a lot of hope and a lot of, there's really the sense that Elena feels like she can be in touch with her mother who's passed away through this relationship with Siobhan, because Siobhan was such good friends with her mother. And, similarly, Siobhan sees something in Elena, they're similar ages, that reminds her of this daughter that she didn't really get a chance to know. So I think there's a lot that's going on in this transaction, and a lot of sort of desire in it. But I think, to sort of return to your question about what it means to inhabit a life, I maybe want to talk about the the danger of this as well, because there is a sort of thriller element of the book, and it's this sense that Elena is she doesn't know how to control what's happening to her. You can think that, in one sense she's inspired. She's not really excited about her dissertation that she's gone to Paris to research, but she is excited about finding Ella, and she dives into these journals. She has dreams about them. They make her imagination more vivid. She talks about how her language becomes enlivened by what she's reading and by the sensual descriptions that she's encountering, and she starts to kind of have these fantasies, and she sees a man in the street, for instance, and she thinks that he's someone that she's read about in the journals, and she thinks it can't, it's not impossible, and she starts to follow this man, and later on she sort of starts to act out things that are happening in the journals, and this becomes incredibly frightening when you realize that not all is not well with Ella, that Ella is incredibly fragile, and sort of losing her sense of what is real. And so Elena finds herself kind of wrapped up in that. So I think it's always a challenge for her to find the edge between kind of, projecting herself into this life in a way that feels engaging and inspiring for her, and sort of tipping over the edge where she's gone, or she's lost control. She's lost her sense of self, her sense of purpose entirely. So where do you stop?
In a detective novel, you kind of are pulled along trying to piece together all the clues to make sense of something. But this is almost more an interior. I mean, that she has to go inside to fictionalize what's going on with these fragments of Ella's life rather than kind of going outside of her own mind to find the facts of the case. But I mean, you've written recently about detective novels, and there is kind of a detective-y element in this book too.
Definitely. Yeah, I wrote a little essay on the narrative thrills of detective fiction, and essentially, I I found myself using the form of the detective novel, even though it's not a detective novel in any in any real way. But I find that in a detective novel, a lot of things from your kind of typical detective story I found useful in terms of creating the plot. This idea that the goal for Elena for is to find Ella. It's not just to sort of create this nice story. It is to actually try to understand what happened to this girl, and to sort of go on this journey that's in some ways too painful for Siobhan to go on alone. So all of the resources of the detective are pulled together. This idea that you have to pay a lot of attention to really small details, that you need to be an excellent judge of character, that the detective has to sort of look at these things that other people would dismiss as inconsequential. Everything has meaning suddenly. And I think Elena, for someone who was having trouble keeping her finger on what is meaningful, I think it was really it put a lot of tension into her character to make her a sort of detective. But of course, the promise of resolution that detective fiction offers is made a little more complicated in the novel. But I think I use that promise of that there will be a resolution, because I think that gives it a tremendous energy and propulsive force.
Absolutely. I couldn't put it down, even though it was like, what's happening? But another thing, Elena is writing her dissertation. This is a great novel about avoiding your dissertation, actually. Is she's writing her dissertation about Chris Marker, the filmmaker. And I feel like he's kind of an animating presence in this book too. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how Marker operates and why you chose Chris Marker as the subject for the dissertation.
Yeah, yeah. Just Chris Marker is kind of French documentary filmmaker. Also made some fiction films. The two that really got my attention were probably the two best known of Marker's films, Sans Soleil and La Jetée, the kind of very short experimental fiction film. And there's a scene in the novel when Elena is in Paris, kind of trying unsuccessfully to research Chris Marker, and she watches La Jetée, and she sees, she kind of sees this man, and she kind of talks about this man who sees himself from the future, watching himself dying, and it, in a way, it sort of starts to foreshadow what will happen, what the journey that she goes on with Ella's journals. This idea that, because she projects so much of herself into Ella, that she kind of imagines Ella as a version of herself, and she's watching from the future, from a point at which she can look back and perhaps make meaning about what's happened. But I think it's this project of making meaning that got me so interested in Marker in the first place. Sans Soleil is this wonderful kind of documentary that follows these sort of objects, and nothing really ties them together apart from Marker's own gaze. And I find something so charming and something so compelling about that, the way that the filmmaker's gaze can sort of tie things together that are disparate in and of themselves. And I just thought, it was a nice, I think one of the things that Elena is really struggling with, both in her work on Ella's journals and in her own life, is this ability to sort of create a narrative or create meaning. And I thought that Marker is someone who does this in a really inventive, lovely way. So that was sort of my maybe more tongue-in-cheek motivation for putting Marker in there as her dissertation subject.
There's also one other cultural figure who comes up in the book. There's a quite interesting, subtle reference to Hemingway's short story Hills Like White Elephants, which I had to go back and reread today. I'm still recovering. I hadn't read it in a while. And and I mentioned this only because it kind of gets at also some of the themes in this book, which are about, children who do and don't happen to come about, and relationships. And I wonder if you could just maybe talk a little bit about the Hemingway reference in passing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Hemingway, it's funny because I didn't think too much about that particular reference when I was writing. It was, I mean, I was an English teacher in Thailand and I was teaching English literature, and that was, a story that I actually taught in Thailand. Although I was not I was not the sort of teacher that Ella is in the novel. I want to assure everyone. And I, so I mean, I think I put the reference in without really thinking about the subtext of the story, which is the abortion that the man is trying to sort of convince the woman to get. But it becomes, and it was a sort of eerie moment when I kind of was looking, in revision, I was looking back and seeing, oh gosh, because this is a situation that Ella gets into as well. And so the idea that that short story and her teaching that short story kind of very lightly foreshadows some of the trouble that she'll get into later in the novel. I think just in a way it wasn't something that I planned, but kind of seeing it come out in the novel was something that I was, it's one of those kind of serendipitous things that sometimes happens when you're writing.
Your unconscious does a lot of work. This is a book, as we talked about a lost daughter and a lost mother, and then also invented selves, imagined selves, selves that come about, selves that don't come about. Before I ask you to read another passage, I feel like this is a good point to also mention your other hat, which is as an academic, in which you are writing a book or have written a book about the concept of embodiment in Samuel Beckett. And it seems like embodiment is also very much what this book is about through fiction.
Yeah, I just sent off the proofs for Beckett and Embodiment, so it's coming soon to a university bookstore in July. Yeah, I think that embodiment, it's funny, I used to really insist that my fiction writing really doesn't have anything to do with my academic work. And my academic work it's sort of research on 20th century French philosophy and its relationship to Samuel Beckett's work, and particularly around this theme of embodiment in Beckett. And
What can you remind us what embodiment is?
just, I mean, I don't have a very kind of technical definition, but what by embodiment, I sort of mean the lived experience of being in a, I don't want to say in a body, but of being a body, and the way in which being a body structures perspective, sensation, interaction, and I think as opposed to this idea that a body is an object, that and of course you can be looked at as an object, and a body is in some sense an object, but really kind of this experience of the lived body is how I understand embodiment. And I think this is a real preoccupation of the novel, if not an obsession, because one of Elena's frustrations as she's reading the journals is that she can't, there's a scene where she talks about, I don't know what's happening, I can't really be in her body. I just have her words. And even though there are these descriptions, I want to sort of know more about what she's experiencing. And I think, and a lot of some of the moments when Elena starts to take on Ella's characteristics are kind of hallucinations that she has about her body, that she's going through something that Ella went through bodily, and that she's using her own body as a way to try to understand what happened to Ella. And she's using, I mean, and body, not just, her own lived experience. And I think it's also something that was important to me at the level of language in this book, in the fiction book. I think it was also something that I did want to kind of pay attention to sensations and make the kind of sensual quality of language, and to just kind of work on the sensual quality of language, whether that was in Elena's voice or in a different register in Ella's journals or in the reconstructed narrative that Elena writes about Ella in Thailand.
Why don't you read us a little bit from a Thailand passage.
This is one of my, yeah, I don't know if you're supposed to have favorites, but this is one of my favorite passages in the novel. And it does need a little bit of background. It comes about 2/3 of the way through. And it's when Ella goes to, she goes on a Vipassana monastery retreat, and she's following, she wants to do it well. She's following these strict rules where she can't eat anything after midday, and she needs to wear these white clothes. And so she's hungry and she's a little sick, and she's been meditating too much, and she's just sort of starting to feel fatigued by this. And she meets a stranger. A bhikkhuni comes up, and Ibikuni is the female, a female nun. And this was a monastery where female nuns, bhikkhuni, and male nuns were living together. So Pranu is one of the male nuns. Okay. The present, hot, makes the joints of the world disengage. Salt tears in the library. Can see no humanity past my own. Mind blown open, turns, returns. Fingernails on the button of Seb's shirt. Meditate on rotting flesh to combat lust. Intestines voided themselves regularly. My body a hollow tube, secreting. Mind bound to sickly flesh, bobbing, rocking on uncomfortable seas. Skin chalk white as the sky. The bhikkhuni brought me tomatoes, saying I needed color in my cheeks. I refused, wanting the full experience. She sat before me, patient, a tomato in each upturned palm. Finally, I took one and sucked at the skin indifferently. With the burst of seeds and juice, there was sensing, taste. Lethargy broke, pure exuberance for the rest of the day. One day, I asked Pranu about the other meditation students. The man who walks more quickly than the others? Yes. He signs the ledger as the man from Augsburg. He doesn't give his name. Why? Is he really from Augsburg? Pranu shrugged. He didn't know. Every year he comes on the same day and stays 3 months. His practice is not typical. He does no sitting meditation and walks too fast. We have to warn the novices not to imitate him. They always try. He builds to 20 hours of meditation per day. In his last week, he stays in his room and sees no one. We bring him food, but he won't eat. And no one knows his story? Look at how he walks, Pranu said, exasperated. It's there, his story. You want more than that? You are nosy. Worse than I am. He laughed. Now go, meditate. Gongs announced the morning meal. Mouthfuls of Pali prayer. Laminated transliterations of Thai and English on the tables. Word designs like serpents would slip into the tympanum through the cavities of the eyes. Breakfast was rice in a watery stew of what may have been vegetables. I left with my usual hunger, which felt like nausea. There would be another meal at noon, then no solid food. Some afternoons there would be ice cream, which is only artificially solid, like all things. Words scooped of meaning collected against me like cicada shells. Way of words. Sibilance just sensation when its semantic privilege peels away. Language carries disease in the form of desire. When the noon gong sounded, I lined up at the refectory, thinking only of tomatoes, skin, color, taste on my tongue. Feeling a hand on my tunic, I turned, wanting to fall against this body, anybody, so as not to have to stand. White hair shone in the sun. He beckoned. Hesitation was brief, ineffectual in the face of my curiosity. We crossed the temple grounds and slipped between the bars of the north gate. His presence focused my thoughts. His smell was patchouli wood. Outside the monastery, a sidewalk curved through conifers and palms. You won't survive like that, he said, walking ahead of me. Rules are important, but you must break them to oblige the intuition. Otherwise, you lose it. Isn't that the point? I asked, struggling to keep pace with him. To lose your intuition? He turned to look back at me. No. But fasting lessens sense desire. It's a way toward freedom. Discipline and moderation regulate sense desire, not murdering one's natural instincts. Do you listen to everything one tells you? I said nothing, concentrating on the path. Proper care of the body and its desires is necessary to a full life. Asceticism on retreat is maddening. Turns out pliant fools, he said, turning to look me up and down, or messes. The walk was invigorating once I learned to lengthen my stride to keep pace with him. We crossed the street, veering away from the monastery. The street was deserted. Where are we going? I asked. Oh, now you're curious. I was starting to worry about you. A tuk-tuk careered around the bend and accelerated past us. We came to a clearing by the road where there was a bamboo-thatched hut and plastic tables on packed dirt. A plump woman was frying noodles in a large wok. I felt relief. A restaurant. Sawadee ka, she called. Aromas woke the senses, herbs frying, the snap of shrimp as they sweated and turned pink. We sat at one of the tables. My hunger was a hollowness that was almost painful. The man from Augsburg was speaking. Words echoed. The world looked large, like a fishbowl. Ignore the body, he was saying. How without nutrients? We have a proverb. The Thais would agree, but it's German. Der Mensch ist, was ist. You can't forget your body. Ist, I mispronounced that. It basically means, humans are what they eat. You can't forget your body, because what is living, other than desiring, dying, eating, fucking? My body cringed at the blow of each of his consonants. Black dots danced before my eyes. Beautiful stuff, he said, leaning in. They say you fast in your last days here, I said. I fast to feed my hunger, like trimming the wick of a flame. I'm going to stop there in the middle of our conversation.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I think it gives you a sense of how every sentence in this novel is so perfectly polished, very thoughtful and philosophical, but also lunch. Also, and the smells. I mean, I was sitting in my house in Paris reading this and was kind of transported to Thailand, where I've never been. This is your first novel, and you've been writing this for some time. So congratulations. To get into the atmosphere of that, is it something that you've been kind of working on for a number of years at red lights, or did you just all of a sudden back in Paris remember that the Thailand of your post-college years was going to somehow come back into your consciousness? Like, tell us just a little bit about the journey.
So you mean getting back into the atmosphere of Thailand?
Yeah, and also just the journey of the novel, but then getting back to the atmosphere of Thailand and Paris. I mean, Paris, you're in Paris.
Yeah.
So
Paris
maybe you need to go to Thailand to have the atmosphere of Paris.
Yeah, it's funny actually. I always said, because I didn't go to Thailand to research this book, and I sort of made that decision, partly because I didn't have the means, but also because I knew that I was recreating, the reconstructed narrative is one that Elena recreates without having been there. And so I had a little bit of help. I have some Thai friends that I kept in touch with. I met a lot with I asked a Thai translator that I got to know through the university where I teach a lot of annoying questions as the book went into copy edit. But I think to get into the atmosphere of Thailand, one thing I did was that, I told you, I mentioned earlier on that I was writing while I was there, and all these, fragments that came to nothing. And I did go back and I looked at some of them. I looked at these old journals, these old sketches with a lot of description. And, sometimes what I remembered wasn't right. I made up words in Thai that don't exist. So, even my recorded memory wasn't always accurate. And so I did have to double check it with research and by asking people. But I did actually consult my own diaries that I kept when I was an English teacher in Thailand. They're nothing like Ella's journals. But I did do that to get myself into the atmosphere, the sense of place that was so powerful for me, and that I wanted to sort of capture again. And yes, in terms of getting into the atmosphere of the novel, I guess this is maybe a more process-based question. I wrote this at the same time as my doctoral dissertation, which is the basis of the book that's coming out this summer. So it was very much, you know, a few months of novel writing, maybe a year of novel writing, and then back into the academic, and then back into the novel. And so I do think it had a kind of strange birth for that reason, because I took so much time away from it. And I don't think that, you know, I wouldn't recommend this as a way to write a novel to anyone, but I do think some interesting things happened because of the sort of stuttering approach I took to writing it. I think it gave me a lot of occasions to come back to the draft and see kind of what its heart was, you know, what its shape would be, and to really start to think about how to stitch together these two very different worlds, the world in Paris and the world in Thailand, and how they could start to resonate and echo each other. And I think that's something that I was able to do more effectively, maybe because I sort of went away from the manuscript for a long time and then came back. So
do you feel like you answered some of the questions that you wanted to answer when you set out to write the novel about the joys and dangers of losing yourself in the character, either at a meta level, like about writing the novel itself, or did you emerge with all kinds of new questions then?
Rachel, it's such a good question. You know, of course I want to say no, these questions are not answerable, but I think in a way, I think part of me was, I think a lot of the questions that I was also asking is like, what does it mean to read and write fiction? And I hope that that kind of meta element isn't too much in the novel. I definitely took out some sections where there's a lot of just joy in Elena discovering that she can write this thing, and so, you know, she complains about, you know, not writing fast enough, or not, you know, being behind schedule, or you know, and she talks a little bit about her routine as a writer. But there's not too much of that. But I do think that, you know, there's something really frightening about writing, or there can be, because you go into territories that most rational, healthy people just turn away from. And I think that those are important parts of the human experience. And I think that there was probably some fear in me as a human, to really dive in and do that, and really kind of get lost in a project. And I think, you know, I in some kind of maybe more personal way, I think I did feel that there was a kind of richness in this, and that you don't lose control. You don't become a raving lunatic. Maybe some mornings, but not most. And that you know, that I think a sense of the possibility of really kind of creating a character, creating two characters, more characters entering into their lives, and feeling like, you know, being able to create something. So no and yes is the reduced version.
Rach, I'm gonna yeah, perfect. We were thinking the same thing.
Questions from our audience. Amanda, this is really, it's great to hear you talk about this work. And I have to say that I do think that your dissertation and this book have a little bit, even the passages that you read, the Thai passages, some of the cadences, a little like someone's been reading Beckett in her spare time. And it you have a completely original voice, but I do hear a little this and that.
That's so interesting.
Rachel, thank you so much. Yeah, Amanda, it struck me that, you know, Beckett's approach to writing Waiting for Godot was as a kind of relief from the trilogy. Had it occurred to you that it was even your approach of writing mirrors
relief from Beckett? Oh gosh.
Can't escape him.
So yeah, we do have some questions in the chat. If you've just joined us, you have stumbled on a wonderful conversation between Rachel Donadio and Amanda Dennis. We're talking about Amanda Dennis's debut novel, Her Here, which is out now. And this is Evenings with an Author, hosted by the American Library in Paris. We're thrilled to have you, and we are now moving on to the question and answer section of the event. So please, if you have not posted already, please post your question in the chat and I will read it out for you. So we have a question from Emma, who says, she says, Amanda, what would you do differently if you were writing the novel again? Or what would you, how would you kind of, would you change anything? You know, do you ever kind of reread a passage and think, maybe in the same way when you were reading your diaries from Thailand and you think, who is this person, you know, and then you read your novel now. Are there things that you would do differently? And then she also wants to know, are you working on another fiction project right now, or, you know, are you just taking a break now that you've published these 2 books?
Emma, thank you for the question. What would I do differently? Oh my gosh. I was actually chatting to Rachel before we started talking, and I was telling her that I auditioned and got the part of reading Elena's sections of the audiobook for this novel. So I did that in early February, and I had sort of submitted the complete manuscript late 2019. So I'd been away from the book for a little while. So I had this very kind of intimate experience of rereading most lines of the book and thinking, oh, maybe that scene, maybe it could have been better. I could have been stronger. Maybe I could have taken that line out. So I think you always do that. I am convinced that it's never really finished. I think I could write this book again for the rest of my life. And I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be better. Maybe it would just be different. I'm not sure. But I do have lots of resolutions for my second novel. I'm not going to write a dissertation at the same time. I've already made that resolution. And I have started it. I'm really eager to get back to it. I have about 100 pages of a draft about a kind of utopian energy commune that gets started on an island in Denmark, where I spent a little bit of time. And I am very excited to start to kind of look back at those pages and get back into work on that novel. So for the moment, I've been doing mostly getting kind of academic proofs off and maybe tinkering with a few stories, but I'm sort of looking ahead to those pages and re-encountering them. Thank you for the question.
Among the many things that you said, I was struck, you had to audition for your own audiobook?
Oh, yes. Oh, no. Yeah, that's not a given. They sort of said, they said, you know, for nonfiction books, and I had no idea that this was the case, that for nonfiction books, it's pretty much the norm to do, to read it yourself. If you've written a memoir, right, it makes sense that you read it in your own voice. But for fiction writers, novelists, it's not usual for novelists to read the book, but for some reason, and I'm not sure I totally understand why, I really did want to do this. I really did want to read it out loud, and I think it might have had something to do with the fact that part of my process as a writer is I'm really sensitive to language and I'm really sensitive to sound, so I do read aloud passages. And I think maybe that was why I wanted to have the audition. But both agent and editor said, don't count on this. You know, it's not a given. So I sent them a few samples of myself recording different sections of the book. It wasn't a hard audition, but the producer got back to me and said, we'd love to have you read this part. So it was great. I felt, you know, like I was back in high school. I'd gotten a part in a play. So.
I like Amanda, don't get your hopes up.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, you know, your kind of remarks about sounds and the sonic element, I think, tie very nicely to Elisa's question, because she makes the wonderful observation that she notices that you used very little the passive voice in the original, in the first excerpt that you read aloud, and in the second excerpt, you use a lot more of the passive voice. And so she's wondering, I guess, you know, thinking about this idea of registers, and you have so much kind of intertextuality in the novel, but how did you choose to use, I guess, the passive voice, the active voice, but also, you know, different languages, kind of, as Rachel was saying, you know, the kind of philosophical musings and then the kind of sensorial lunch. How did you make those decisions?
Yeah, I think, so I did think a lot about register, and maybe not so much the passive voice, though you can push me on that and we can talk more about that. I think the things that were most important to me when I was deciding on what kind of characteristics for each of these voices were things like tense. So for Elena's sections, I knew that it had to be in the present tense because she just doesn't know what's going to happen to her. You know, her life is still very much in the making. Whereas for the novel that she's writing, it has to be in the past tense because she's casting a narrative structure back over what's happened. So she's writing from a point in time at which she can see the past. She's writing after it's over. And I think that I have to admit that the reconstructed narrative sections were hard to write, because I had to sort of keep in mind this idea that there's an Elena behind the Ella character, that this isn't just Ella kind of talking about her life. This is Elena trying to be Ella. And so I think that, how would Elena write this scene? What parts of herself does she put in? What parts of Ella's kind of information does she put in? In some scenes you can even see little bits of Elena's life in Paris, just little, like, little markers. So I think I was thinking a lot about how to create the voice so that it seemed plausible that this was a book narrated by someone sitting reading journals. But the passive voice is interesting. I haven't thought about that. I'm gonna have to think more about that.
Oh, we just got 2 questions all at once. I guess this question of voice, again, going back to the voice, and you saying, reading aloud is maybe one of the ways that you kind of edit your work or work with your work. And so Hilary wants to know, can you talk a bit about how you captured each narrative voice or each narrator's voice? And in particular, she wants to know about the sweet, intense naivete of Ella's journal.
Yes, thank you, Hilary. Yeah, it's so this was really I think this was the hardest part of the writing process, getting these 3 voices separate, because I'd be working on them, I'd be thinking about each one, and trying to get each one in a completely different register, and then I'd have someone read it and say, oh, they kind of sound similar, and I thought, no, how can they how can they still be similar? So eventually what I did was I took the novel apart, and I took the novel within the novel, and I just revised that, and I revised it for voice, and I took just Elena's sections and I revised those for voice. And yeah, I think and Ella's, sorry, Ella's journals were I don't know, those were really fun to write, I think, because I wasn't thinking too much about these questions of voice. I was just trying to put myself in the body of a kind of troubled and excited 22-year-old encountering things that she couldn't have imagined. So I think that's kind of what went into the Ella's journals part, just kind of pure exuberance in some of them.
This is a personal question that I had that I would like to add. Did you feel that, you mentioned kind of in your discussion with Rachel the slipperiness of self? Did you feel that your self, were there moments where you kind of, to what extent were you projecting yourself into Elena, into Ella, and did you feel that you were kind of losing your identity in the mix, and how did you kind of, I guess, rein that in, or let it mingle and infuse and we speak to that?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. I think for me, and I try, and I've heard other writers say this too. So I don't, I think this is something that other people do. But I think I try to put a little bit of myself into every character, even the ones that don't resemble me at all. I mean, I think that's how you get them kind of round and real. And but I do think I put a lot I put kind of little special pieces of me into Elena and Ella. I think.
Can you give us some examples?
Oh, well, I mean, I think also just, the fact that I was, when I was 21, I went to Thailand and taught English, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and, and made a lot of mistakes and had a lot of fun and adventures. And I think I was able to channel that when I was writing Ella. My own naivete, I certainly drew on that for sure. And I think it was funny because with Elena, I'd get frustrated with her as a character. I'd be like, come on, don't be so, don't be so boring, or don't be so solitary, or just, so I think that, but I could put, the Beckett scholar part of myself into Elena. She's a PhD student, and I think there are moments, as much as I love kind of scholarship and I find it interesting, it's a very solitary process, as some of you in this Zoom room know too well. And I think there were moments when I, that frustration that I experienced certainly went into something that I wrote about Elena's character, because I was really creating her while I was doing the dissertation. So yeah, but I don't know, I think I was sort of, it's such an interesting question to think about, but my gut wants to say, I think it was really kind of the other way around. I felt like I was putting maybe more of myself into the characters than taking on their characteristics.
Thank you. And the final question, we ask many of our authors this, but we must know, since we are a library, what are you reading at the moment?
Oh gosh, okay. Well, I have a few things, but I'll keep the list short. I'm reading Lisa Robertson's The Baudelaire Fractal. She's a wonderful Canadian poet, and this is her first novel, and it's absolutely enchanting. It's beautiful, beautiful language, beautiful, kind of beautiful plot. It's this woman who wakes up and thinks she's written all of Baudelaire's writing. So I'm loving that. I'm also reading my colleague Biswamit Dwivedy's first collection of, I think it's his 2011 collection of poetry, Ozalid, and it's absolutely amazing. I'm loving it. And then I'm also almost finished Maëlle Renoir's Fragments of Infinite Memory, translated by Peter Berman de Sinati, that I'm actually doing a little event about tomorrow. And that's also really, really interesting and beautifully translated. It's about how the internet has changed our way of being in the world, our sense of self, our way of doing scholarship, our way of writing books. And that's also just been fantastic to read. I'm going to stop there. But
thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you, Rachel, for being such a wonderful question asker and close reader of this wonderful book.